This is Steffen Schmidt. Wanted to basically put a little perspective on how we're defining coastal policy and international coastal zone management. We tend to get frozen by the term and assume that coastal policy means something that is right on the coast, that it's beaches and marshes and maybe a little bit, a few hundred yards offshore into the ocean. The reality, as you will find as you study coastal zone management, is that there are a whole series of places that are highly relevant to the discussion of coastal policy, and a whole series of behavioral, political, and management issues that in the end converge to affect coastal zone management and coastal policy. The reason we call this coastal policy is frankly because the edge of most countries and continents basically crashes into the ocean, and it is at that point where the history of human beings has often been very exciting. People have traveled along close to the shore to get to other places, and have used the bounty of the ocean in order to maintain viable settlements and be able to also transport goods from inland to other places. And so the shore and the coast has been crucial to the development of human societies around the world. On the other hand, coastal zone management does also include the kinds of habits and behavior of people on shore and further inland. And in particular, one example would be the consumption of fish and other edible marine products. We know that many of the issues of the balance of ecosystems around the world are closely tied to the increase in population, the increase in the capacity of harvesting and consuming anything that comes close to shore or close enough for people to grab it and turn it into a food or a different product. And so the exhaustion of fishing, the decline in whales and other fish, the decline in whales and the decline in fish, the decline in marine mammals, the impact on coral reefs as a result of too many people over harvesting, the crash in the turtle population also as a result of the fact that turtles were easily captured and conveniently transported for long voyages on their backs as food, and their shells could be used to make other commercial products. Those all, have led to coastal areas that are no longer the kind of homeostatic environments in which everything is in balance that they were a long time ago, and in most places are no longer. So human behavior and human activity then has replaced traditional activities on the coast. And if you were a fishing community and there are no longer any fish or any shrimp or any turtles, you have to find a different way to make a living. And very often nowadays that has resulted in the substitution of traditional sustainably harvested, let's say shrimp and salmon and other fish, with industrial enterprises that produce those products along the coast. And we know that therefore overfishing, for example, in the Caribbean has been a tremendous problem, and there are efforts to try and ration the amount of fishing that takes place so that it does not result in a collapse of the sustainable population. But if you've ever traveled to the Caribbean, we do this very frequently in order to do research on human impact on the marine and coastal zones. You will be aware that in most places there are no fish. I mean, there is a wonderful restaurant in Bequia that we like to go to, and their menu is filled with fish dishes. But when you try to order them, most of the time they say there's no fish. And that's simply because no one was able to catch any. We were recently in Mustique, and by pure coincidence, our fellow researcher Paul Schmidt discovered that the fishermen had just come in and that they actually had brought tuna. And so he managed to go and snag us a couple of nice tuna from the local fishing community. But as the restaurant chefs and homeowners rushed down to the fish market, the number of tuna and other fish that were available for themselves, for restaurants and homes, vanished very quickly because there just aren't very many left. So when we study coastal zone management, we may also want to study the human behavior and population density as it impacts things that are farther out than just the immediate coastal zone itself. We also know from recent research that substituting naturally raised or naturally occurring food populations with food pens where shrimp and salmon and other products are artificially raised produces a tremendous negative impact, because usually it means the destruction of the coastal immediate coastal ecosystems such as mangroves, which are torn out and replaced with fish pens, which then create a secondary ripple effect of making those coastal areas highly toxic, because dense fish populations usually can't survive in pens, so they have to be fed antibiotics in huge quantities, and that produces a big impact. The escape of species that are being raised in pens that are usually not the local species, so you get an invasion of imported species into the local ecosystem, and that causes a chain reaction among local species. And finally, of course, those coastal zones that have had mangroves and other naturally occurring vegetation and ecosystems replaced with industrial facilities become incredibly vulnerable to hurricanes, to storm surge, to tsunami damage, and so on, because there's no longer that barrier of protection along the coast between the ocean, which can be pretty brutal, and inland areas. So human behavior and human activity, seafood restaurants and the consumption of a lot of fish and so on are also part of coastal policy. So I would say that as you look at the material that we assign, at the stuff that we do, you can look at something like this map behind me, which is a map of the Gulf of Mexico showing all the different places where there are oil rigs and pipelines in the Gulf of Mexico. That's one area of coastal zone management, studying very focused systems and very specific areas of activity such as oil drilling, oil production, extraction, transportation, and so on. And you can do that around the world. I mean, there are places all over the world where offshore oil is being produced. In fact, if you have been following the news here lately, the French government has just announced that they are exploring a new type of nuclear power plant that will be a completely self-contained capsule that will be a nuclear power plant that can be deployed, parked, and run offshore, away from people and away from cities and so on. That's another extraordinary new development. And of course, local fishermen, people who live from harvesting crustaceans and other things, are very worried about the potential effects on their livelihood and on those particular products. But so as we move forward, I think we're going to see a further and greater intrusion along the coastal areas of things such as oil drilling, gas drilling, nuclear power plants, and in many cases, for example, in Florida and in several other places, including in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, in areas of the world where there are narrows and straits, in the Pacific and so on, in Asia, discussions about placing enormous marine turbines in the currents, and those turbines become power plants, and those power plants then produce electricity with the naturally occurring currents of the ocean. In the course that I'm developing, that's called Water World Revisited, and it's a course on the futurology of the coastal zones and oceans, we will look in more detail at those. There are also very odd floating devices that move up and down with tides and with waves, and in their motion are then producing electricity, and those have been deployed experimentally, and there's a lot of interest in those. They look like long sausages that are all interconnected and have devices in them that are essentially the same as self-winding watches, if any of you remember those, where your watch was basically charged by the motion of you moving your arm and walking around. Well, these produce electricity in the same way. And so I wanted to just take a little moment here to philosophize, if you want, a little bit about what all we throw into this stew called coastal zone management, international coastal policy. Because clearly, if you look at Japanese election banner here behind me, the behavior of Japanese in regard to sushi and eating seafood, including whale meat, is a cultural phenomenon which has had a tremendous impact on fishing and on the oceans. And so just again, we don't necessarily in this class deal with the problems specifically of fisheries, but we should deal with questions about how fishing, fisheries, overfishing, and generally the overuse of coastal zones becomes a policy question, becomes a policy concern that countries need to take into account, and in some cases are beginning to take into account. Who would go to the Caribbean if the reefs are all dead, and if you can't see colorful fish, and if you can't see turtles and stingrays and shark and other wildlife? It would be a tremendous blow to a tourism industry in particular. And so there are these interconnections between coastal activities in which preserving fish and other marine life may be valuable in its own right, may be valuable to preserve species, may be important in order to preserve a source of food. But on the other hand, it's also becoming more and more crucial for having a sustainable economic infrastructure in the hospitality and tourism industry. In that case, I think, should be made, and coastal zone managers ought to become more involved in making a larger case than just the narrow coastal zone and coastal policy issues that we often try to concentrate on, because it's those bigger issues often that can be more fruitful in a policy debate, can be more convincing to politicians and policymakers and to public opinion in places around the world. So please think about coastal policy and coastal zone management in a larger and more interconnected and synergistic perspective. This is Professor Steffen Schmidt. Thank you.